Chapter 1. Refuge in the desert. Moses never grew used to the silence of the desert. Though his days were filled with herding, the slow pace of the sheep, and the occasional sound of wind between the rocks, there was a void that time could not fill. Ever since he had fled Egypt, carrying the weight of a crime and the fear of an uncertain fate, he had tried to find peace among the sands of Midian, married to Zipporah, daughter of Jethro, priest of the land, and living among a simple people. Moses tried to bury the traces of his past, as if silence could smother the cries of a people still groaning under the yoke of slavery. But nothing ever truly faded from his memory. He still dreamed of Egypt, the palaces, the language, the cries of the beaten Hebrews, and that day when, driven by a sense of justice, he killed an Egyptian and watched his life fall apart. The escape was quick, desperate. Finding shelter in Midian had been almost a miracle, but Moses carried within himself a restlessness that even a new life could not ease. He knew he wasn't like the other shepherds. He had been educated in Egypt, learned to read, to write, to think like a prince, but now his days were reduced to tending animals and helping with the clan's chores. It was as if he tried to deny everything he once was. Even so, each evening, as he sat in the shade of a rock with his eyes fixed on the horizon, he felt something calling him. It was a subtle discomfort, an invisible presence that seemed to watch his steps. He didn't dare name it. It was easier to follow the routine. Until that day. A day like any other. The sun burned harshly and Moses led the flock farther than usual, in search of fresh pasture. He climbed the slopes of Mount Horeb, known among the locals as the Mountain of God. He expected nothing more than dry bushes and stones, but then his eyes caught something strange. A bush in flames. The fire danced around the plant, but it was not consumed. It burned without being destroyed, as if the flames embraced it without harming it. Moses approached, curious but cautious. Something inside him whispered that this was no ordinary sight. As he drew closer, a voice echoed, firm, deep, "Moses, Moses." He shivered. He looked around, but no one was there. The voice seemed to come from the fire itself. "Here I am," he replied, heart pounding. "Do not come any closer," the voice said. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses obeyed. His feet touched the hot earth, and he felt small, exposed, as if standing naked before something far greater than he could understand. "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Moses covered his face. He did not dare look. This was no dream, and fear overtook him. God then spoke of the cry of the Hebrew people, the pain that rose to the heavens, the oppression by the Egyptians, and finally, the plan. Moses would be sent. He would free the people from Egypt. He would be the answer to centuries of pleading. Moses didn't answer immediately. God's words echoed in his mind like thunder. Him? Deliver the people? How? Why? "Who am I," he said, "that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" It was the first of many refusals. Moses doubted himself. He had been away from Egypt for years. He was just a shepherd. He had no authority, no voice, no courage. But God didn't back down. "I will be with you," he said, "and this will be the sign. After you bring the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses hesitated. He wanted to disappear. His past condemned him, his present limited him, and the future terrified him. So many questions, so many fears. "What if they don't believe me?" he insisted. "What if they say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" God, patient, showed him signs. Turned his staff into a serpent, healed his hand from leprosy, promised words and wonders. But Moses still resisted. His voice trembled. "Oh, my Lord," he said, "I have never been eloquent, neither in the past, nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." God replied firmly, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak." Still, Moses backed away. "Please, Lord, send someone else." Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, but it did not come with destruction. Instead, God offered a solution. Aaron, Moses' brother, would speak for him. Moses would carry the message, and Aaron would be his voice. God's plan was set. There was no more running. Moses would return to Egypt. But in his heart, the weight of doubt remained. Even after meeting the God of his fathers, even after seeing the fire that did not consume, he hesitated. Not out of disobedience, but fear. Fear of failure, fear of not being enough, fear of confronting a past he had spent years trying to forget. Moses's path to accepting this calling didn't begin with courage. It began with questions, insecurity, attempts to escape. But what happened on Mount Horeb changed something inside him. It was no longer possible to live as before. God had found him in the silence of the desert, in the most unlikely moment, and spoken with a clarity impossible to ignore. Even afraid, Moses had listened, and that was the first step. Chapter 2. The Weight of the Past. The silence after the encounter with God on Mount Horeb was not the same silence Moses had known in the desert. Now it was heavy, filled with echoes of words he could not forget. Each step back down the mountain felt like walking away from everything he thought he knew about himself. He was no longer just a shepherd, no longer just a fugitive. God had called him. God had chosen him. But inside Moses, the struggle had only just begun. As he descended with the staff still in hand, the same staff that had turned into a serpent, before his eyes, his mind was filled with questions he couldn't silence. Why him? After all this time, after all his failures, why would God choose someone like him to confront Pharaoh and lead a people to freedom? Back at the camp, Moses said nothing. He moved among the tents with a distant look, speaking little to Zipporah and his sons. He was there, but not truly present. His mind wandered to Egypt. The memories came back in waves. The cries of the oppressed, the blood on his hands, the face of the Egyptian he had killed. Would anyone even remember him after so many years? Or worse, would they remember exactly who he was and what he had done? He feared both possibilities. He feared being forgotten as much as being known. When he finally spoke to Jethro, he did so with caution. "Let me return to my own people in Egypt," he said, "to see if any of them are still alive." It was a vague excuse, but Jethro, wise and quiet, simply nodded and blessed his journey. Perhaps he sensed there was more behind Moses' decision than he was willing to share. With his family beside him and the staff in hand, Moses set out toward Egypt. The road was long, not only in distance but in the emotional weight it carried. At night by the fire, he stared into the flames and remembered the burning bush. How different that fire had been. That one had spoken. This one only reminded him of what he had left behind and what he would soon face. Along the way, fears crept in again. What if he wasn't heard? What if Pharaoh laughed at him? What if the Hebrew people rejected him? Every scenario played in his mind like a storm he couldn't calm. Then, in a strange and terrifying moment during the journey, the Lord met Moses again, not in fire but in confrontation. The scriptures say the Lord sought to put him to death, and only the intervention of Zipporah, who circumcised their son and touched Moses with the blood, stopped it. It was a cryptic, intense moment, one that marked Moses with the seriousness of the mission he had received. This was not a path he could walk carelessly. Obedience, holiness, and covenant mattered. As Moses approached Egypt, the air itself seemed heavier. The lands grew familiar. The scent of the Nile, the sound of distant voices, the silhouette of the cities on the horizon. It was a return he never thought he would make. Meeting Aaron was a strange comfort. His brother came out to greet him, sent by God. And Moses finally had someone to share the weight of everything he had seen. He told Aaron everything. The fire, the voice, the signs, the mission. And Aaron believed him. That belief alone was like a balm. It reminded Moses he wasn't alone. They entered Egypt together, not as warriors or kings, but as messengers of a God who had not forgotten his people. When they gathered the elders of Israel, Aaron spoke as Moses instructed. He told them that the God of their fathers had seen their suffering and had sent Moses to lead them to freedom. The people listened. And when Moses showed them the signs, the staff turning into a serpent, the leprous hand healed, they believed. They bowed and worshipped, filled with hope for the first time in generations. Moses watched in silence. It was the first moment of acceptance, the first glimmer that maybe, just maybe, this path wasn't madness. Yet even in that moment of peace, the shadow of Pharaoh loomed large in Moses' mind. He knew that the true test was still to come. Convincing his own people was one thing. Convincing the king of Egypt would be another. And so, Moses stood at the edge of a new beginning. Not yet bold, not yet fearless, but willing. Willing to speak even when his voice trembled. Willing to return even when the past haunted him. Willing to lead even when he still felt like a broken man. The fire had not made him perfect, it had made him aware that God's call was not based on perfection, but on surrender. The journey was just beginning, and the hardest chapters were yet to be written. But Moses had taken another step. He had walked toward Egypt, toward his fear, toward the people who waited. And for the first time he was no longer walking alone. Chapter 3. The resistance of Pharaoh. Moses stood at the gates of Pharaoh's palace, the same gates he had once walked through as a member of the royal household. Now he returned not as a prince, but as a messenger of a God Pharaoh did not know and certainly did not fear. By his side Aaron waited for the signal, ready to speak. The court was tense. Egyptian nobles and priests lined the room, casting glances of contempt at the two Hebrews who dared stand before the throne. Pharaoh, seated on his elevated platform, gazed down with amusement more than concern. He didn't remember Moses as a threat. He remembered him as a traitor. And now, after decades, this exile returned with demands. It was a challenge to Pharaoh's authority, and worse, to the gods he claimed to represent. Aaron stepped forward and spoke the words Moses had received on the mountain. "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." The room fell silent. The weight of those words hung in the air like a storm about to break. Pharaoh's expression hardened. "Who is the Lord," he said, "that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." His voice carried not just disbelief but insult. The God of slaves had no place in the court of Egypt. Moses remained silent, watching. The moment was unfolding exactly as he had feared. Pharaoh's pride was too great and Moses' own confidence too fragile. But the message had been delivered. Pharaoh, rather than being moved, responded with cruelty. He increased the burden on the Israelites. No more straw would be provided for brickmaking. They would gather their own materials but still meet the same quotas. It was a calculated move, not just to punish the people, but to turn them against Moses and Aaron. And it worked. The Hebrew foremen were beaten, humiliated, and when they saw Moses, they cursed his name. "May the Lord look on you and judge. You," they said, "you have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." Moses was crushed. He had obeyed, spoken boldly, trusted the signs and the calling. And now, the people suffered, more than before. Their pain had deepened and their faith in him evaporated. That night, alone in his grief, Moses cried out to God, "Why, Lord, why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued them at all." It was raw, unfiltered honesty. Moses no longer cared about sounding faithful or strong. He spoke as a man disappointed, broken, and deeply unsure. He had done what was asked. He had confronted Pharaoh. And yet, nothing had changed, except for the worse. But God's answer came, calm and resolute. "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh," he said. "Because of my mighty hand he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand he will drive them out of his country. And then God repeated the promise, that he had remembered his covenant, that he had heard the groaning of the Israelites, and that he would deliver them with an outstretched arm. He told Moses to speak again to the Israelites and assure them of deliverance. But when Moses did, the people refused to listen. Their spirits were broken by harsh labor. Hope had been crushed by Pharaoh's oppression. Their ears were closed and Moses' voice was no longer enough to reach them. Even then, God did not abandon the plan. He commanded Moses to go again to Pharaoh. But Moses hesitated. "If the Israelites will not listen to me," he said, "why, would Pharaoh listen to me since I speak with faltering lips?" The cycle of doubt returned. Moses questioned not just the people's faith, but his own ability to fulfill the mission. The weight of rejection, the sting of failure, and the fear of being ineffective pressed down on him, but God did not withdraw. Instead, he reaffirmed his instructions, gave Moses and Aaron commands, and spoke of what was to come. The mission was not dependent on Moses' eloquence or the people's readiness. It depended on God's power and his timing. As the days passed, signs and wonders began to unfold. Confrontations with Pharaoh escalated. The staff turned into a serpent before the king's eyes. The Nile turned to blood. Frogs, gnats, and flies invaded the land. Yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He treated each sign as a trick, each plague as a challenge. His magicians imitated some of the signs, giving him reasons to doubt, and each time he refused to let the people go. Moses began to understand. This would not be a short battle. The plagues were not just punishments, they were revelations. Each one struck at the heart of Egypt's gods, proving that the Lord of the Hebrews was not a distant tribal deity, but the true and living God. Still, despite these displays of power, Moses struggled. He obeyed, yes. He went to Pharaoh, performed the signs, repeated God's words. But his heart remained heavy. He saw the suffering increase, saw Pharaoh mock their God, saw the people's despair deepen. Obedience in the face of resistance tested him in ways the burning bush never could. Back then it had been a call. Now it was a confrontation. Back then it was fear of the unknown. Now it was pain in the present. Yet Moses did not give up. Slowly, each step of obedience strengthened something inside him. Not pride, not confidence in himself, but a growing awareness that this mission was bigger than his fear, that God's plan didn't rely on Pharaoh's cooperation or Israel's faith in him. It rested on God's faithfulness. And that would be enough. Moses was still afraid, still uncertain, but he kept going. And in that stubborn, reluctant obedience, a leader was being formed. Not through triumph, but through trial. Chapter 4. When the plagues speak, the land of Egypt no longer slept in peace. The days were filled with dread, and the nights echoed with the cries of a people caught in the grip of something far beyond their understanding. Pharaoh, once untouchable and divine in the eyes of his people, now stood face to face with a reality he could not control, and at the center of it all, Moses. The shepherd-turned-prophet who had once trembled before the fire, now stood daily before the most powerful man in the world, proclaiming the same words without hesitation. "Let my people go." The plagues were not random. Each one struck not only at Egypt's comfort but at its gods. When the Nile turned to blood, it was a direct blow to Hapi, god of the river. When frogs overflowed into houses and palaces, it mocked Heket, the goddess with a frog's head. When the dust turned into gnats, it challenged Geb, god of the earth. Each sign was a declaration. The God of the Hebrews was above them all, and yet Pharaoh's heart remained hard. He begged for relief, then rescinded his promises. Over and over again, Moses and Aaron came before him. Over and over again, the king refused. But something in Moses had changed. He no longer flinched, no longer questioned his place. The doubts that had once crippled him now stood behind him. He was no longer trying to prove himself. He was simply obeying. He knew the outcome was in God's hands. Each time he lifted his staff, each time he delivered the message, it was not confidence in his own strength that moved him, but certainty in the one who had sent him. Among the Hebrews, things were different now. At first, they had lost faith in Moses, seeing him only as the man who had made Pharaoh's fury worse. But as the plagues came, darkness over the land, disease among the cattle, boils on every Egyptian, they began to watch. The distinction was clear. The land of Goshen, where the Hebrews lived, was spared. While Egypt bled, they were protected. That protection didn't erase their suffering, but it stirred something deeper: hope. For the first time in generations, hope had a name. The Lord had seen them. Moses, too, had begun to feel the weight of what was coming. With each plague, the tension between heaven and earth grew. Egypt was a boiling pot ready to overflow. And he knew it wouldn't end until Pharaoh's pride was completely broken. God had said so. Still, there were nights when Moses sat alone, thinking not about the next plague, but about what lay beyond them. What would freedom mean for a people who had only known slavery? What kind of leader would he need to be for a people who didn't, yet know how to walk free? Then came the warning of the final plague. God's voice was clear and heavy. One last blow, one that would make Pharaoh not just release them, but drive them out. The death of every firstborn in Egypt. It was no longer a message of signs or wonders, it was judgment, and it would change the history of both nations. Moses delivered the warning. Pharaoh, blinded by his own arrogance, refused again. And with that the countdown began, but before judgment came instruction. God gave Moses the laws of the Passover. Each household would take a lamb without blemish, slaughter it, and place its blood on the doorframes. That night when the destroyer passed through Egypt, the blood would be a sign, a covering, a shield. God would pass over those homes. It was the first time the people were called, not just to believe, but to act, to participate, to trust the word of Moses not just for signs, but for salvation. As Moses walked through the streets of Goshen that evening, he saw families preparing the lamb, roasting it whole, eating it in haste with staff in hand and sandals on their feet. The air was thick with tension. Children asked questions, parents whispered. It was the night before everything changed. Moses stood at the door of his tent, watching the blood on the wood, the same wood that once carried his staff, now marked with obedience. That night, no one slept. Then, at midnight, it happened. A silence fell over Egypt, and then the cry. A single wail, then thousands. From the palace to the prison, from the richest to the poorest, every Egyptian household was touched. Pharaoh's own son was dead, the god king of Egypt crushed. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the dead of night. His voice was broken, no longer defiant. "Go," he said. "Leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds and go, and also bless me." Just as God had said, the enemy now begged them to leave. The people of Egypt, terrified of what might come next, gave the Hebrews silver, gold, and clothing. They weren't just released, they were sent out as victors. But there was no celebration yet. Only movement. After 400 years, the children of Israel were finally free. But Moses knew this was only the beginning. Freedom from Egypt was the first miracle. Learning how to live in freedom would take a lifetime. Moses had obeyed. He had faced Pharaoh again and again. He had endured rejection, fear, failure, and the growing burden of leadership. But in his obedience, God had revealed his power, his justice, and his mercy. What began at the burning bush now echoed across the land in footsteps, heading away from captivity. And Moses, once the reluctant man who begged for someone else to be sent, was now at the head of a nation on the move. Chapter 5. The Wilderness. Between, freedom came not with fanfare but with footsteps. The Israelites marched out of Egypt not as slaves sneaking away in the night, but as a multitude walking through the ruins of an empire that had tried to break them. Moses walked among them, not as a king, not even as a hero, but as a man still learning to lead. Behind them, Egypt mourned its firstborns. Before them, only wilderness. The path to the promised land wasn't paved in gold. It was dry, uncertain, and filled with questions no one had ever dared to ask. What now? Where do we go? Who are we now that we're no longer slaves? God didn't take them by the shortest route. He led them into the wilderness away from the Philistine territory, because he knew their hearts weren't ready for war. The people followed, but with each step into the unknown, their fear grew. Moses, holding the staff that had brought plagues and parted waters, felt the weight of every complaint. The people still saw him as the face of this journey, and they began to murmur. Why did you bring us out here? Was it because there were no graves in Egypt? Did you bring us here to die? But God went before them, a pillar of cloud by day, a pillar of fire by night. It wasn't just guidance, it was presence. The fire reminded them of the bush that didn't burn. The cloud reminded them they were not alone. Moses saw it too. Every night, when the fire lit the darkness, he remembered that voice from the mountain. And every day when the people looked to him for answers, he remembered that it was never about him. He was not their deliverer. He was only the one who answered the call. Then came the sea. The Red Sea, wide and unyielding, stood before them like a wall, and behind them, Pharaoh's army. He had changed his mind. Egypt would not let go so easily. The people saw the chariots, heard the hoofbeats, and panicked. Again they turned on Moses. Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? The fear was real, the danger closer than ever. Moses didn't have an escape plan. He had no army, no defense, only obedience. And in that moment of crisis, God spoke again. Why are you crying out to me? Tell the Israelites to move on. Raise your staff. Stretch out your hand over the sea. It was madness. But Moses obeyed. He lifted his staff, stretched his hand, and the wind began to blow. The water split, towering walls on both sides, dry ground in between. The people moved, not running in panic, but walking through a miracle. Moses stood as the last one, watching them pass between waters that should have swallowed them whole. The sea had become a door. On the other side, freedom waited. And when the last Israelite stepped out and the Egyptians pursued, the sea collapsed. The oppressor was drowned in the same waters that had opened for the oppressed. The people cheered. They sang. Miriam led them in dance with tambourines. It was the first song of a free nation. But Moses didn't celebrate for long. He knew the wilderness wasn't finished with them. Freedom from Egypt didn't mean the end of struggle. It meant the beginning of transformation. Days passed. Water ran out. The people grumbled. Food ran out. They cried. Every lack became a reason to doubt. Every obstacle, a reason to wish they had never left Egypt. Moses listened, not just to their complaints, but to the silence that followed. And then, God provided. Water from a rock. Manna from heaven. Quail in the evening. It wasn't about abundance, it was about trust. God was teaching them to depend on him one day at a time. But the deeper challenge wasn't hunger, it was identity. They had left Egypt, but Egypt hadn't left them. Slavery had shaped how they saw themselves. It taught them to fear, to expect punishment, to wait for permission. Now they had to learn something new, how to walk as a people who belonged to a God they couldn't see, but who walked with them daily. Moses felt the tension. He was leading people still chained by their past, even as they walked in freedom. Leadership became heavier. Moses had to judge their disputes, hear their complaints, carry their burdens. He felt himself wearing thin. That's when Jethro came, watching from the outside, and spoke wisdom. You cannot carry this alone. Appoint others to help you. It was a moment of release. Moses didn't have to do everything. He had to listen, delegate, trust. Just as God was teaching the people, he was shaping Moses too. Then came Sinai. The mountain loomed before them, wrapped in cloud and fire. The same God who had spoken from the bush now called an entire nation to come near. But only Moses could go up. He climbed alone again into the fire. And there, God gave more than words. He gave identity, law, covenant, a new way to live. Not as slaves, not as Egyptians, but as a holy nation, a people set apart. But while Moses was on the mountain, the people below grew restless. They wanted something to worship, something they could see. So they made a calf of gold. They said, "This is your God, Israel, who brought you out of Egypt." And in that moment, the weight of their past returned. Moses came down to chaos. Anger burned in him, not just because they had sinned, but because after all they had seen, they still didn't understand. Yet Moses didn't give up. He pleaded with God to forgive them. He offered himself in their place. "Blot me out of your book," he said, "if you won't forgive them." He wasn't the same man who once ran from the fire. He now stood between God and the people, willing to bear their guilt. Leadership had broken and remade him. The wilderness wasn't the place they expected, but it was the place they needed. It exposed the heart, revealed the wounds, and shaped a people for something greater. Moses walked it every day, staff in hand, heart heavy, eyes on the fire ahead. And in that long in-between, the man who once said, "Send someone else," had become the shepherd of a nation. Chapter 6. The Purpose in the Fire. The journey was longer than anyone expected. What should have been a march of weeks turned into a trial of years. The desert wasn't just sand and silence. It was a mirror, a teacher, a test. And Moses walked through every step of it, no longer asking, "Why me?" but learning instead to ask, "What now?" The man who once hid his face before the burning bush had become a leader forged by resistance, refined by waiting, and remade in obedience. The people were still learning. The wilderness was both punishment and preparation. It stripped them of Egypt's illusions and exposed their dependencies. They grumbled, they feared, they failed, and yet God remained. Pillar of cloud, pillar of fire, daily manna, fresh water, forgiveness after rebellion. Moses watched this cycle play over and over again, and in it he saw not just the weakness of the people, but the patience of the one who had called them. Mount Sinai was behind them, the golden calf, forgiven, the covenant, restored. The tabernacle was now built, God dwelling among them, visible, in glory and fire. Yet the promised land still lay ahead. When they finally reached its edge, spies were sent to survey the land. What they brought back was not just a report, it was fear. Giants, fortified cities, danger, and once again the people panicked. They refused to go. They wanted to return to Egypt. They said, "Let us choose another leader." The same old chains, now without Pharaoh. God's response was swift. That generation would not enter. Their children would inherit what they had rejected. The wilderness would be their home until unbelief was buried in the sand. Moses received the judgment with sorrow. He had walked this far with them, carried their burdens, faced God on their behalf, and now he would walk with them through the consequence of their fear. Years passed. Children grew. Fathers died. The nation that had come out of Egypt slowly gave way to a generation that had never known slavery. These were desert-born, fire-fed children who had learned to walk in freedom even before they learned to speak. Moses poured into them everything he had learned, not just laws, but stories. The plagues, the sea, the mountain. He reminded them again and again. Remember the Lord who brought you out. Do not forget. Do not turn away. But Moses' time was nearing its end. On the edge of the Jordan River, across from the land promised, long ago God spoke to him once more. You will not cross over. It was not punishment, it was clarity. Moses' role had never been to finish the journey, only to guide the people through the part they couldn't walk alone. He would see the land, but not step into it. And still, he did not resist. He gathered the people one last time. He didn't give them a battle plan. He gave them memory, reminders, warnings, a song, a blessing. He told them not just who they were, but whose they were. He spoke not as the man who once doubted his voice, but as a prophet who had found purpose in his obedience. He didn't beg them to follow. He declared the truth and trusted that the seeds he had planted would grow. Then Moses climbed Mount Nebo, alone again, as he had been so many times before. From there he saw the land, rolling hills, distant rivers, green pastures, the future his people would inherit. He didn't cry. He didn't ask why. He stood quietly, staff in hand, and let the sight fill him. And there, on that mountain, God received him. No man ever knew where he was buried, but his legacy didn't die in the dust. It walked across the Jordan. It echoed in the hearts of prophets. It shaped a nation, and it pointed forward to another deliverer who would one day walk up a mountain with wood on his back, face resistance, offer freedom, and not just from Egypt, but from sin itself. Moses' story wasn't about success. It was about surrender. He never became the confident speaker he feared he wasn't. He never became the perfect leader, but he became something greater, a man who answered the call, even when it burned. And in doing so, he showed that purpose isn't found in power, but in presence, not in being strong, but in being willing. From the bush to the mountain, from Pharaoh's court to desert silence, Moses' life teaches one truth again and again. The fire of calling doesn't consume, it refines. And when we stop waiting to be ready and start walking in obedience, we find that the path ahead, no matter how long or hard, is exactly where we were meant to be.